And I understand the resistance to it based on race, right? So for example, you see a lot of people who will say you can't ever talk about racial differences in IQ because that is going to lead toward this racist conclusion that your race defines your IQ, which is, a silly conclusion. Like, there are racial differences in IQ based on kind of group statistics, but that has no relevance to the particular individual standing in front of you. And so you saying this black guy is stupid because he's black is racist. You saying there are group differences in IQ because every study ever done has shown group differences in IQ, not even based on racial groups necessarily, but based on different groups generally between age groups. There are differences in IQ actually. If you show that, at least from young age to like 12, if you mention any of these things, then you're overriding the idea of a tabula rasa human being who can be created in whatever image you want. Like, what people really want is to correct the cosmic imbalances, as Thomas Sowell says. I don't know, what do you think is behind it?
I think you're hitting the nail on the head, and I think there's a tremendous amount of white guilt involved in it as well. I mean, because basically what the IQ tests are showing when they do study differences in IQ and races, you're showing the rise of the superiority of the Asian race. I mean, Asians dominate those things, and everybody just sort of just like, well, that's let's not talk about that. Let's talk about white and black because that's more convenient and it's easier, and they could find a victim and they could find a perpetrator. And what you're also seeing, like, there's a lot of Asian groups that are furious because they're getting discriminated against about getting into colleges and universities. They have higher standards because they have such a high percentage of Asians that are getting into the universities. And it's very strange because they're not vocal about it, and they're not publicizing it, and they're not screaming racism in the streets, but they're the victims of it. They actually are the victims of hard work and success and excellent genetics.
Right. Well, there's no question. And the differences in culture are really the place where we should be putting most of our focus, because when it comes to, natural imbalances, there's only so much that you can do, right? I'm not going to be fighting you in a ring anytime soon because I'd just get destroyed. But but when it comes to cultural differences, that's the stuff that we can correct for. And instead of doing that, what we tend to do is we tend to pretend that the cultural differences are not brought about by immediate decision making by parents. Or by immediate communities. It's something out there, right? It's racism in the ether, or it's discrimination writ large. It's something out there. We can't put our heads around it exactly, but it's something that's making us imbalanced. And so the way to fix that is by getting rid of all imbalances that we see. And so if there's an imbalance between men and women, we'll just pretend that doesn't exist anymore, and that it must have been caused by something that we can't quite control.
Yeah, it's definitely not an objective way of approaching the issue. I think there's a host of different factors that play into every community, right? There's the echoes of the poor behavior of the people that lived there before you, all the consequences of other people's actions that have affected all the people around you, people going to jail, people that have experienced racism, people that have experienced poor treatment by law enforcement, massive distrust around you, very difficult to excel in those environments. You're constantly like running away from gangs and headed home. I don't think we should hold those people up to the same standards as we should people that grow up in very safe middle-class communities where they don't have to worry about all this stuff. I think there's a bunch of different factors, and everybody's looking for one.
Exactly.
And the one factor that appeals to their ideology.
Yeah.
I think that's a real problem.
And it's a problem also, anytime you mention IQ, everybody goes nuts because immediately they suggest that what you're saying is racist. And the truth is that whatever IQ differentials there are, it's unclear how much is explained by genetics and how much is explained by environment. But some is clearly explained by genetics and some is clearly explained by environment. As soon as you say that, everybody suggests that you are operating in a racist space. So it's as you say, when it comes to data, like this happened with Sam Harris when he was being interviewed by Ezra Klein. Right? Ezra Klein just went after him for suggesting that science is science. Well, science is still science, even if you don't like the science. And it seems like the same thing should apply when it comes to biological differences.
Because these guys do bring in this air of intellectual validity, if you will, to these matters. And so, Ben Shapiro, I don't understand what the hell he's doing. You're Jewish, bro. These kind of eugenics ideas were prominent in the United States and Canada. These ideas, these IQ ideas, these dragging the rest of us down ideas, almost kept you from existing. the pseudoscience of a group dragging the rest of the herd down. Get your folks gassed. I don't know how you get out here and dabble in any of these ideas like IQ that are just rooted in. Let me explain something to you. Hitler. You know, they have these kids write. There was a class. It was like split a sheet in half and write down the pros and cons of slavery. Because I live in a culture that wouldn't dare to say what's the pros and cons of the Holocaust. But when you talk about slavery, they're better off than you being in Africa. Are you nuts? It just shows how far this culture is steeped in its own ignorance. So Hitler was a poor Austrian who became a kind of a MAGA hat wearer, who was a true believer in these ideas, even though he didn't fit the description. But German Nazism that led to the Holocaust was based on American eugenics. And the eugenics societies in the United States, someone were quoted as saying things like, at least Hitler had the courage to see it through. Now I'm black. So if Hitler wins World War II, maybe I speak German. Hitler is almost responsible for freedoms that half the black people in this world have, ironically. He doesn't get a poster. I don't wear a swastika because he was a bad person. But, pros and cons kind of way. The colonial powers arming and having to enlist those black and brown colonies who later in the 50s and 60s gained their independence because of weakened masters. Of course, that coincided with black soldiers coming back here from helping out in the war and giving rise to civil rights movements in the 50s and 60s. So ironically, the great racial oppressor freed most of the world's black people. That's logical. That's factual. We're not going to put him on the calendar. So it's silly to just speak in these kind of tone-deaf ways. And I wouldn't be as aggravated as if he didn't spend the first, 10, 15 minutes of the video saying, hey, we talk to people. It's all about free speech. All it's about is an exchange of ideas, all this open-mindedness. And he asked him one thing about being open-minded and having the ability to speak. And then 90 million bigots pull their pants down as he goes into, and you'll be called a racist if you bring up the fact that IQ tests prove that black people are stupid. Yeah, you will. I don't care if you couch it into, well, look how well the Asians do, and the Asians are so smart, and the Asians are doing well. And if you're worried about the Asians having a seat in college, why are you giving them the only black seat? Give up a white seat. Give them all the white seats. Expand the college. Create more seats. There are other options besides, sorry, Blackie, we'll pick anybody before we give y'all an opportunity. There are other answers. But now you're supposed to be trying to pit it as Asians. We're not saying blacks are stupid. We're saying Asians are really smart. Asians ain't really fucking smart. Since when the hell are Asians really smart? When? 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 We done spent the last 100 years trying to damn near stomp them out of existence. We're talking about China. We're talking about Japan. We're talking about North Korea. We're talking about, so that's not smart. You don't think Asians are smart all of a sudden. You don't have a newfound respect for Asians. They wouldn't looking to them for guidance when they were punishing them here, building these railroads, or putting them in internment camps. Nobody think Asians are smart. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite of smart. If you are drilled to death and penalized to death and don't have any fun and can't go outside and can't play and only can do math for 4 hours after you get home from school, you're not smart. Smart is a knack. Smart is not drilled to death. That's not how smart works. So it's the same thing of white kids getting the advantage. Oh, I scored higher on my test. Should have. Get a computer, quiet place to study, college educated parents, freaking tutor, prep, test and exam, fake Adderall prescription to get more time on the test. You should have scored higher than some fucking body with that many advantages. I mean, let's speak up. So Aunt Becky's going to jail. Let's talk about legacy. Let's talk about real affirmative action. So, long story short, IQ, who the fuck said you are qualified to quantify intelligence? If black people weren't intelligent, you wouldn't be here. Everybody came from Africa. We had to survive long enough for everybody else to even exist. There's not a science, there's not a mathematics, there's not a anything that didn't start in Africa. Nothing. Not a monotheism, engineering, language, community, everything can be traced back to Africa. Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, every time there was an update to humanity, like a software update, it came from Africa. It didn't come from anywhere else. So let's stop it. Let's stop needing IQ to prove something. And this little game of all we're doing is saying Jews are over here and the Asians are doing really well. And oh my God. It's nerve-wracking. Let me tell you what would happen if the IQ test had white people down here and black people up here. They'd make a new test. That's what they'd do. They'd make a new test because white people complain. Obviously, you're not factoring in seeing either because by virtue of those results proves the test does not work. Let me explain that to you. You cannot get static results from something that's not static. So, as I showed in another video, if you concede two things, race has no definable or discernible or consistent characteristics. Less than one page. It's a social construct, only been around a few centuries. It's not real. Or we either don't define it consistently, at best. Right? So you can't base anything on something that doesn't have any consistency to it. So if you produce results, and then people in this group consistently score lower, that's cultural, right? That's cultural, not genetics, because we have the same genetics, because there's no race. So then when you say, well, an IQ test based on a test that's giving you results on something that doesn't exist, consistent results on something inconsistent. That's what your IQ is telling you can work. That it can consistently predict that the people are in a group that does not exist. You're not as intelligent as you think you are. That is insane. In other words, God didn't create race. So it's not there genetically. There are no markers to it. Your test is not aware of my race, right? Your test has no awareness of race. So how can it consistently end up with scores for a group that does not exist? It's a weird paradigm to try to make something work. So in other words, getting back to cultural bias, then is something you put in the front for it to recognize something that it would not recognize. Your bias put your definition of race in it, and that produces those results. There's no other explanation. There's no other logical or sane explanation outside of you put the garbage in and you got garbage out. Remember, no consistent characteristics for race. So the test cannot, it would be impossible to consistently put people in a group that does not exist. It would be the same thing for Asian. There's no genetic Asian. Asians have the same DNA as the rest of them. God did not create a different intelligence gene for Asians. This is back to that same old racial pseudoscience. And dabbling in racial pseudoscience is the art of consistently, historically racist. So I don't mean it as a slur. I just mean it as a fact. That is the thing that racists did, which were people looking for justifications and rationales to either find something consistent to define race or justify racial structures. That is what a racist is in that context. You know, outside of the cross burnings or yelling or lynchings and stuff like that. In this other context here, in this sphere. Not the religious one where it was just from being cursed. It was over in this one where it was in the matter of, and then Joe Rogan goes on like he has no context for history. How about taking a test for politics? I don't think any Republicans understand any issues. Can I write the test? It have a lot of black stuff in it, right? And they're just like, bro, you just don't get it. Get out of here. Cancel culture. See, they always want to exclude people. You know, if somebody trying to exclude them, then it's their free speech and it's their right and it's cancel culture, whatever. But that's all y'all do is constantly looking for ways to cancel other people's rights out. And don't like that game to be played on you. So Joe Rogan almost steps in it. And then they get into this conversation a little bit and start to swing around of but you don't want to bring up, families in jail or whatever else. I don't want you to be called a racist, but we're just going to go from genocide to stereotypes. We just went from eugenics, which is used for justification for genocide, over to stereotypes, because none of the black people have any family, parents, or anything. That could be poor test performance. Your test is broken. How about that? You should be able to gauge the efficacy of your test if it lumps in consistently people into a group that does not exist. That is not genetically defined in any kind of way. Especially as something as stupid as intelligence. You can be genetically taller than somebody. You can have some consistency in height. But an amorphous term like intelligence, no. You can't define race, and you can't define intelligence, and you can't really define where they overlap. It's ignorant. And you'd know it's ignorant because the people that created everything wouldn't end up at the bottom of a test. The people that built all the ancient empires and all Western Europe has is Stonehenge, are not going to end up at the bottom of the test. All right. So I'm not even going to get into that, because then I'll be Afrocentric. But you need to learn a little bit more history and stop telling yourself people evolved into white people or civilization came along with white people. It's Lord of the Rings. You've had the ring for 500 years. We had it for thousands. Look it up. It's not new. This thing kind of goes around. It spawned a lot of this east coast of Africa, across the Mediterranean, into Eastern Europe, and then Eastern Europe imposed it on Western Europe. And for 800 years of the Dark Ages, Africa was colonized into the Iberian Peninsula. And it's just a coin flip that the blackamoors don't go on and take over Scandinavia, the British Isles, Germany, France, and whatever else. And this whole dynamic goes this way instead of this way. If you'd have told somebody in 1450, this is how it played out, they'd have laughed you off the planet. That the English, Spanish, or whatever else were going to rule anything. They couldn't stop fighting amongst themselves, and the Spanish couldn't even take control of Spain. So it's just a fluke of history that these things come together and you ended up with the ring. Not the most intelligent or nothing. It's happenstance. It's a fluke. You're not first, you're last. It's already happened. They have the pyramids, they have the Great Wall, they have the Aztecs and the Mayans or whatever else, and you have Stonehenge. You last. Enjoy it. I have no problem with it. I'm learning history, got rid of all my anger. White people ain't even had a turn yet. Knock it out. It's your turn. Do your thing. I ain't mad about that. I'm going to fight for my rights and the rights of the oppressed, so on and so forth. That's always happened. It happened if you're oppressed in the future or when you were oppressed in the past. That's just the way the world goes. But stop with this IQ. Sorry this is long, but it has to be. Because the reason I set the site up or the channel. And again, like I said, not to just be another smarmy commenter, but to break down simply why these people are wrong. Jordan Peterson says you can't define race and admit that it's a possibility that you put your bias into the test. That's a wrap. His words, not mine. He already told you what the fly in the ointment is. He already told you why you can't rely on it. So, sorry. Put your dick back in your underwear and get off to something else. But IQ and racial stratification, just gonna get you labeled a bigot and ignored. As usual, fuck you. Don't need you to subscribe. Don't care about your comments. I'm a grown ass man, so my life doesn't revolve around likes. I'm just some guy, and only I know what's best. Have a great night.
Ouvre-la,